Good evening. I'm Juan Zabala, Vice President at Lamar University, and it's my pleasure to welcome all of you to our digital gathering of alumni and friends of Lamar University. Through this digital gathering, we have an opportunity to speak with distinguished alumni of Lamar University, and you've tuned into a really special program tonight. We've managed to convince our friend Larry Beaulieu to join us this evening. Larry retired as Vice President and General Manager of KFDM in Beaumont after 37 years of service. Larry started his mass communication by studying mass communication at Texas Tech University. He was a student announcer on campus for the on-campus FM radio, and he was an off-campus announcer for both AM and FM radio in Lubbock. Also in Lubbock, he worked for KLBK, the television station, as a photographer, a reporter, a producer, an anchor, and a radio news reporter. Following 4 years in Lubbock, he moved to Amarillo, and for the next 5 years, he had roles at KFDA TV, which included photography, on television photography, news photography, reporting, production, and an anchor. His final move, fortunately for us, was to Beaumont, Texas, where Larry came to work as news director and anchor and producer at KFDM. He also became general manager at KFDM in 1982. While he was at Beaumont, Larry enrolled at Lamar University, where he received his mass communication degree from here in 1977. He was named Distinguished Alumnus of Lamar University. He was named Distinguished Alumnus of our Communications Department here at Lamar. And in 1995, sorry. And in 2000, he was named Outstanding Alumnus of the Texas Tech University Department of Mass Communication. He has served on the board of the Texas Association of Broadcasters and was the president there in 1999. He's the recipient of the Beaumont Rotary Club's the Lamb Award and a Paul Harris Fellow of Rotary International. He was named Pioneer Broadcaster of the Year by the Texas Association of Broadcasters, and he was the first ever recipient of the Freedom Communications Freedom Leadership Award. At Lamar University, he served as a student advisor and as a member of our Mass Communication Advisory Council, and he also served as the Texas State University System Legislative Liaison. He served on the boards of the Beaumont United Way, Rotary Club, Chamber of Commerce, Goodwill Industries, Foundation of Southeast Texas, Crime Stoppers, Christus St. Elizabeth, and Capital One Bank. Larry, you're a busy guy. You've been a busy guy. We appreciate your taking the time to join us this evening.
Well, it's my pleasure to be here tonight, Juan, and I'm honored, and so it's good, I guess, to be back on the air in front of the camera after 9 years of retirement. So I've enjoyed it and had a good time. So it's great tonight, and hello to all the fellow Cardinals out there.
Well, thank you. It's kind of cool to see you you weren't in this position like the rest of us were, but it feels right to see you in front of the camera and hear your voice again. So we appreciate your being with us. So Larry, let's talk a little bit about what we want to focus a little bit on. A lot of our audience will be alumni and friends of Lamar. We also have students who are part of our mass communication program. So we will get questions during the evening from both groups. So I'm going to try to keep talking to sort of both audiences as we go along the way. But I'd kind of like to get a sense from you on how your career, other than what I just read, how it developed, how you moved into broadcasting, and how you made decisions sort of to move to new areas and change your career in the ways that you did.
Well, the beginning of the story is really an accident. When I was a freshman going out to Texas Tech University, for some reason I thought I wanted to be an electrical engineer. And so you go through that little counseling period, and I asked again, how much math did you just say was going to be involved in this? And anyway, there's a little intervening thing, but on a weekend, there were a lot of little cardboard signs up all over campus that said the campus 10-watt radio station was looking for announcers that semester. And some friends of mine said, you ought to go try that. And I had no idea why they were trying to ridicule me into doing that. So I did. Went over there on a Saturday morning and showed up, and basically anybody that could fog a mirror, I think, got brought on board as a radio announcer, and didn't know anything about it at all. And so I really happened into it that way, and that's a true story. So once I got interested in radio, and it was just kind of the fascination of all that, I guess. And then news began to capture my attention. So I found a way to do some radio news at another station, and as well as an announcer, and then into television. And so how I made decisions about where to go next were typical of any kind of job change. I mean, you look at the economics of it, and and as is still today, the broadcasting industry was never a high-paying industry. And I mean, I made a move from Lubbock to Amarillo when I got $100 a week raise. So, it was one of those things. So it was somewhat economic, but from the professional side, I was always interested in the broadcast of news. And after having been involved in the gathering and the producing and the delivery of news product on radio and television for a number of years, like anybody else, I thought I could probably do a better job of leading a group of people to do it than those I was working for. So I was looking for a news director's opportunity. I wanted the chance to try to lead a team. And actually, that's what brought me to Beaumont in 1974. Yeah.
So in Beaumont, let me tell everybody something we all know. We have unique moments because of weather conditions in our region. So when it's during a time of a hurricane or flooding, where we go for our information is to Larry Beaulieu on either radio or television. So I just kind of want to get a sense from you on sort of the challenges of kind of a big responsibility to keep people informed and safe in a way when you're a reporter or a news director in a place like Beaumont during hurricanes or other storms.
Well, as is usually the case in any organization or operation, the key is to have really, really good people. And so I am still today, very proud of the fact that I hired Greg Bostwick, because Greg Bostwick has become the gold standard for weather forecasting and in particular hurricane coverage. And so an interesting story that I tell is that he was still pretty new to the staff, and some hurricane was out in the Gulf, and the National Hurricane Center kept forecasting. This is many, many years ago, before a lot of the sophisticated satellites and so forth were available. And the Hurricane Center said that storm is going to come to the Southeast Texas coast. And Greg told me privately, or not privately, but, he said, I don't think it is. And he'd been studying his little paper faxes. And he said, I think it's going to Mexico. So I thought about it and I said, well, I heard you to do the job. So if you think they're wrong, if you want to go against the Hurricane Center and call it for Mexico, do so. And he did. And of course, the end of the story is the storm went to Mexico. So from that day on, we all get, hurricane information today from hundreds of places. And, but Greg is still my go-to guy.
Yeah, well, and for many of us too. So.
But it is a large responsibility. And things have changed over the years because now, back in those days, evacuations were rarely called. And there was a whole different legal system behind the evacuation calls and so forth. So the key for us and our goal was to provide accurate information, but to provide it calmly so that you could digest it, not to panic people, to try to give them enough information to, if they could, make their own decisions about their preparations and or evacuation, but at the same time to give them advice, because a lot of times people go, I'm new here, I've never lived through one of these, tell me what to do. And so we had to, dish out advice, so to speak, too, about how to deal with these storms. So you just try to do it to serve the public the best you can. And then there's the other side of it where you're managing your own personnel and your own resources and your operations, which is another whole story. Yep.
Well, so you touched a little bit on the changes, and you were focusing on the changes of forecasting and evacuation. But in your career, your field changed pretty dramatically with sort of a 24-hour news cycle, if you want to call it, so information out there, and then actually legitimate news sources competing to get real news out there instead of just sort of reactionary stuff. So can you walk us a little bit through how you managed to keep a solid news feel when you know that there's these sort of instant information that's being delivered that is not very news-y?
Well, the change has, and I'll go back to the days when most households got most of their news from newspaper or radio. And probably the print side was the more comprehensive and the more detailed information that families felt like they needed to have. Then broadcasting came along, and radio in the 30s and 20s, and then finally television in the late 40s and mid 50s. And to provide news programming initially for broadcasting was, I think, pretty much a way to satisfy an FCC requirement. They would grant you a license, but you had to serve the community needs. You had to serve the public need. And that entailed a number of things. But news obviously became one of those. And then as that technology advanced and as the audiences became, had shifted their appetites, well, news became a huge part of broadcasting. So I can remember when Walter Cronkite's CBS Evening News was a 15-minute program, and that was it. There was no other network news on. And then we all know how the network newscasts have expanded by hours and hours every day. Same thing happened locally. Local television stations might have a 6 o'clock newscast. Then they began to have a noon newscast, and then some of them added 5 o'clock shows. And then the morning was discovered, and they started doing 1 hour in the morning, hour and a half. And I don't even know how many hours they're on over at the local stations now, but I know some of those people are getting to work pretty early in the morning. So as those appetites grew, it also, and from a business standpoint, it was a large audience gather. So therefore, it brought in a lot of revenue, so it made sense to expand that as much as you could to try to increase your revenues. Then overlay that with cable initially. Cable television initially, their business model was to take signals from metropolitan areas and to the rural areas. So just as an example, you might say, well, a cable system, if I was going to go into that business back here in the 50s and 60s, I'd put a cable system in Jasper because the signals up there are not real good. So we're going to put up a tall antenna, get great signals from Beaumont, and then we're going to wire those signals into homes in Jasper. So that was kind of their original plan until they discovered the multi-channel aspect that consumers wanted, where they go, oh, now I can get the local channels and some other things. And there wasn't much there to offer to begin with. But once that technology was there, then people began to produce programming for it. And so you saw the number of channels available on cable just explode. And then they moved it into the metropolitan areas where it was less expensive to run wire from houses that are a few hundred feet apart rather than a mile or two apart. So then cable became available. Then the whole 24-hour news thing started because I guess people could point to Ted Turner and the CNN network on cable. That's probably the first national cable news network that sort of prompted the explosion that we see today. And it was so convenient for people. You could tune in any time, watch for about 15 minutes or 30 minutes, and you're caught up on the news cycle. So that left local stations with a niche of only local content being the prime target. Yeah. So that was the focus of local stations, was to try to produce as much local news as you could so that you could compete with people who were getting their national news appetites served by networks or cable networks.
We've got a couple of people asking questions as we go along, so I'm going to hold one of them off for just 1 minute. But let me ask you: is there a sort of, I'm thinking local news, but it doesn't have to be that way. Is there a story or a storyline that was particularly challenging or interesting or unique for you in your career that still stands out on the choices you had to make to report that or not report some parts of it?
Well, I think that from time to time, and I think that, and it's been a fault for many years, I think, of broadcast journalism, that the daily news content coverage plan at best started the evening before the next day. And in most cases, those discussions about where to deploy your limited resources, meaning reporters and cameramen, for that day, those were done in 8 a.m. meetings that morning. And so you were making a lot of decisions on a very short fuse. And this is my description of it. So the problem, this is a shortcoming that I think has gotten worse, has gotten worse in broadcasting over years. So you had limited resources. You had a lot of stories to choose from, ranging from some ribbon cutting to some governmental meeting to some what we would call breaking news. I mean, you're always interrupted by fires and explosions and traffic accidents and things like that. So the decisions usually were sometimes based on, well, is this the story that the most people are going to want to see? Because you were still in a competitive environment. You had, in Beaumont, for example, primarily 2 other newsrooms that you competed with. And so you were trying to make choices about the stories you could do that would be of the most interest to the most people. And sometimes that can get in the way if you're not careful about making smart decisions or good journalistic decisions. And I can talk about the whole state of broadcast journalism as a separate topic here in a minute, because I don't think it's good. But I think that sort of thinking has sort of led to some problems. Now, yeah, I think you were asking for a specific story. And I don't remember anything particularly from a journalistic standpoint. I think if we felt like the story was a good story and we had the facts and we had good sources, and hopefully the news directors and the editors that were in these newsrooms asked these reporters enough questions to make them really demonstrate that the story is valid. You don't just say, well, whatever you think, just go do it. So you do that to kind of protect the integrity and reputation of your newsroom. Probably the ones that might be, these weren't journalistically confusing, but we would have stories sometimes that would conflict with sponsors. So you might have a consumer report on a local business. And, all businesses have consumer complaints, but you would get enough of them or something happened. And so you would think, well, maybe we should report on that. Well, then, of course, the client calls up and says, well, if you run that story, I'm taking away all my advertising. So then, you're dealing with now the news department, the sales department, and the general manager's office. So, and I've been in 2 of those 3. And I will say that KFDM, during my tenure there, either as a news director or as a general manager, if it was important, even if it was in conflict with a client under those kinds of conditions, we ran the stories, which doesn't always happen in other newsrooms, I think. But anyway, so those are the kind of things that you run into. And then sometimes you have this, not so much a journalistic thing, but we had a hurricane coming ashore. We always have a core group of volunteers who come and work, and we all stay and sleep at the television station. So we had a standing policy that after dark, we don't want everybody out on the streets unless we've discussed it and where you're going and what are you going to do. And so word came to me about 2 a.m. one morning that 2 of our anchor talents had taken it upon themselves to go to Sabine Pass because they wanted to go down and see the storm come in. So, yes, it could be a great story. B, you could have been killed. So we had to have a little discussion about that.
While you were talking, Larry, I was trying to think, because you're talking about what interests a community. That means as news director, as GM, you kind of have to understand your community as well as understanding the news and advertising and the like. So how does a person who reaches that level, how did you become well enough versed in our community to sort of get a sense of what stories would have the greatest interest to a broad audience?
Well, I think that if you live in a community and you're involved at all in any level with some sort of organization, whether it just be your church or, civic clubs or whatever, but if you're in the news game in the city for a while, then you pretty quickly, not pretty quickly, but you learn the lay of the land after a while. And Beaumont was a little unique compared to other cities I had because the industrial base here was different. Primarily, obviously, still petrochemical, much more union influence when I first came than we have today. And that was all new to me. So I had to understand the relationship between industry and workforce and labor unions. Then you also learn, as in all cities, there are people that are the movers and shakers or the power brokers or whatever you want to call them. So you just learn kind of who's who in town and so forth. And that was always the challenge because the Beaumont television market was sort of an entry level market for new reporters. Most of the reporters that we brought aboard either had one job for a short period of time in another market, or this might be their first job just after they graduate from university or college. And they're the smartest people in the world. They know everything already. And so to get them to understand, for example, go cover city council. You ever been to a city council meeting? No, never been to a city council meeting. And it's like you have to re-educate them. Okay, this is an agenda. These are taxes. This is how city manager and city council form of government works. And I mean, they know some of that. I'm exaggerating to some degree. But underneath all that, you also had to have an understanding. And they'd come back from city council and say, well, person X seems to have this connection or, has this thinking or whatever. So you sort of have to explain who these people are, where they come from, how they got where they are. So you begin to understand, those different things. So anyway, yeah, but it's a matter of just living in a community long enough to have been exposed and to know what's up. Does that make sense?
It makes sense. And now my curiosity gets ahead of me and I start to ignore our audience. So let me go back to ask some of the questions. But Shannon, one of our viewers, wants to know, what were some of the things that you would do to prepare before you went on the air?
Is that Shannon that works with you?
It is. I wasn't going to disclose that it was.
I thought I recognized that name. Hi, Shannon. So what did I do to get ready to go on the air? Well, after a while, and I don't mean to be flippant about this, but when I was general manager and then through a tangled circumstance was still doing the 6 o'clock news, my joke was I'd go over there at about 15 minutes to 6 and ask if the scripts were printed yet and what were the big words for tonight, because I needed to know what the big words were. But but after it takes a while to gain those skills to sit there and just read, not be intimidated, not get nervous and so forth. So after, when I first started, you're scared to death, you're nervous, you read scripts aloud, you go in a closet and read it and go out there and hope for the best and so forth. But after a while, and they would have to remind me, because after we went into high definition television, we had airbrush makeup. They'd have to remind me, you need to come put your airbrush makeup on. And I did not come from the makeup TV school. I did not come from that world. So as you might be able to tell tonight, I've done nothing about this aging face. So the preparation was from that standpoint of just delivering the product. Now, the whole production part of it is much, much more involved. And so, and it was helpful in the days when you mentioned that those jobs like reporter, photographer, producer, anchor, well, you would do all those things because one person, those weren't specialized jobs. Almost everybody in the room could do it. But it was a benefit because, you helped cover the story or you talked closely with the reporter who was covering the story. So it wasn't some cold group of facts that just came in front of you on a piece of paper and you produced it or you wrote it. And as you know, you can read what you wrote better than you can read what someone else wrote. So that was helpful. I mean, there were times when Cecile Burant and I wrote all the copy that was read at 6 and 10 o'clock.
Wow. Wow. So it got me to thinking, again, your world is something I really have not experienced. My little sort of dip into this kind of thing, the reality is you mentioned Shannon, and you and I, when we got to this point, Daniel is sitting over here taking care of business for us. It requires that you have a really good team. So I guess as GM and news manager, you also were required to understand all the technical parts to know which were the best people to hire to run those operations.
Right. So a typical television station, at least in the news side of it, take sales out of it. And I know Daniel was in promotions for a while. Take promotion out. So it's production, engineering, and news. Those three teams have to get along and have to understand each other's problems. But you also have to really understand the technology of it, because from the mid 70s up until the late 90s, probably, the technology changes in television were large and frequent. And so our capabilities, so for example, when I came to Channel 6 in 1974, we were still shooting 16 millimeter film. Wow. So you go shoot some film of a house fire, you have to have that back in the building an hour before you need to go on the air, because it's got to be processed. Then it has to be edited. Then those edited pieces have to be glued together, timed, and built onto one reel of all the stories that are going to run that night in order. And so there's that technology. You had to understand that. You couldn't just say, I'll be back at 10 minutes to 6 with the film of this fire. And the guy doing the film processing would say, then your film won't be on the air. You know, it's one of those things. So then you move into videotape and electronic cameras. And that was a culture shock for a lot of people who we had finally taught to splice 16 millimeter film. But to sit down in front of two VHS tape machines connected by a joystick controller and two monitors, and to get them to understand the process they were going through was the same as film, but it just wasn't film. And you didn't have to glue anything. You just had to push these buttons. And so then live broadcasting came in. We got microwave equipment in which we could do remotes. And that was a whole nother learning curve. And all this stuff came boom, boom, boom. Then we went to digital, got rid of tape. So you did have to understand all the technologies. And you also had to understand the production side of it. So the people that are doing what Daniel's doing tonight, that's not an easy task. And that typically involved 4 people. Somebody to switch video and audio and to run character generators and other things. So, and that they all have to be on the same page, doing everything according to the script, or it's not going to work. So the clashes would happen because the talent, there would be a problem, and the talent would immediately blame the production department. They'd punch up the wrong camera. You know, we'd see Daniel tonight instead of you and I, and some, ego-headed anchor person would go nuts. And, so you had to throw cold water on everybody and get them to understand each other's, walk in their shoes a little while, So anyway, yeah, it was fun, but that was the fun part of it, because when those teams really worked together well, and I was so very, very fortunate to have great people that worked at KFDM, no matter what the job was, from sales to wherever. And it was always a common goal to make KFDM the best, and therefore the most popular television station in the market. And it had that history as its base. And I was fortunate in that I had 5 or 6 department heads responsible for leading teams. And all of those people had, for the most part, 20 years experience or 15 years experience, which was sort of unheard of in a market this size. So what I sort of refer to the TV station is we were running a graduate school for broadcasting. So we would take younger people, and then we would sort of re-educate them and take them up to another level to understand all aspects of this business.
Yeah. Wow. So there are some questions coming in, but I'm going to have to tell you, Larry, a lot of the feedback we're getting is something that Daniel and I talked about earlier today, is hearing your voice again is kind of brings comfort. Becky, one of our viewers, said she was so comforted hearing your voice again, and I'm going to tell on Daniel, but he and I were talking earlier. Daniel said when he hears your voice in his mind, it's about time for dinner, right? It's so. Anyways,
That's the habit we tried to develop. We want you to have dinner, watch TV, and then and do that every night on Channel 6.
There you go. So one of the next questions we have is from one of our retired, very distinguished faculty members, and Mary Alice wants to know what advice you would give to young graduates who are starting out today. What would you tell them? Where would you tell them to go, and how to get to it?
Well, first, good evening to Mary Alice. It's good to hear from you. So my advice has always been, if you're a young graduate with a degree, and I guess now most of them are mass communications, or broadcast journalism, the universities have become so sophisticated in their structures. But and I presume that it is still true. So I've been away almost for a decade now. But typically, most of them want to be a news anchor. That's their stated goal. That's the first thing they'll tell you. And we would have openings for reporters or photographers or producers, and literally have scores of applicants for an opening. There was so much supply against so little demand, at least up until 15 years ago. And I presume it's still that way, maybe not. That I would tell them, take any job anywhere that you can get. Take any internship in particular. If you can get any internship while you're in school, and let's say you get a 1 year or 2 year internship opportunity in your third and fourth year of school, that puts you a year and a half, 2 years ahead of the rest of your competitors when you graduate. So internships are always valued highly. But people would say, well, I graduated and I'm going to get a job in Dallas and be an anchor. Well, let me give you a cold dose of reality. The chances of that happening are slim and none, as they say. You're going to need to go to Beaumont or Abilene or Alexandria, Louisiana, or some other smaller market, and you're going to have to take a job, and you're going to have bad hours, and you're going to do a lot of things that you didn't think you might be doing as you envision yourself as a star news anchor. As you report and as you learn to write, as you learn to gather facts. But if you do that, and the track used to be, if you would go take that kind of job for about 2 to 3 years, then you were marketable in a larger market. You might be able to get a job in a Tulsa or New Orleans or San Antonio as a reporter. Then if you stick with that for about 10 years, then you might, or less, you might get into a news anchor slot. And that there's a lot of variation in those timetables. But my advice to young students is, just get prepared to work hard for not much compensation for a few years. And if you work hard, then you'll stand out from the rest of the people that are in your situation, and you'll move up.
Excellent. Well, and sort of following along on that, what was the things that you learned that were most valuable to you when you were a student in college, or maybe something you didn't learn and you wish you had sort of learned while you were a student?
Well, we'll start out with the full disclosure. I was a horrible student and did not, as those grade school and middle school and high school teachers would always write, does not apply himself well. So when I started at Texas Tech and decided that I was going to be in this field, at that time in the mid-'60s, Texas Tech University, we became part of the speech department, and we were speech majors with an emphasis in radio and television. And we had one instructor, well, we had 2 instructors, I guess, who had actual experience. And we had just a handful of direct broadcast courses. So that was in the mid-'60s. So, and I applied myself to those because those were fun courses. I would go work at the campus TV station or the campus radio station and so forth. But so those courses were somewhat limited. So the journalism courses were important. But then it was the other things. And so that was a period in time, at least in my case, in my life, where at the end of 4 years, my student deferment was running out. A military student deferment was running out. And I got married. And so it was, $100 a week raise was a big deal. So I took a job that took me away from Lubbock and my continuation at Tech. So then when I came to Beaumont, I had the opportunity. One of the instructors here was leaving to go work on some graduate work. And so Lamar, Dr. Brentlinger reached out, and they were hiring professionals in town to come teach different courses at Lamar. So I was asked if I'd come and teach an introduction to radio broadcasting course. Never taught a day of my life. It's the hardest job I've ever had, I might say. A big tip of the hat to all teachers at whatever level. So I said, well, I'm going to be out there doing that anyway and making a huge sum of money. I forget how much money they paid us to do that. I'm kidding. It wasn't really much, but it was nice. But I said, I like about 25 hours or something of finishing a degree. And I see some courses out here. But mainly what I needed at Lamar was some history and couple of speech classes and so forth. So I was teaching radio broadcasting at Lamar and taking some other courses. And but it was very enlightening to me, particularly to interact with students, again. So it was fun.
Excellent. Well, we're going to move back to another question submitted by one of our audience members. And Karen is, first of all, thrilled with this behind the scenes look at your career. But she wants to know if there were any particular stories that you, worst or best, that you really liked reporting in your career, or something that you really wished you had not had to be involved in your career.
Well, I think in terms of, quote, everybody says, well, what's the biggest news story you ever covered? And that's, for me, that's just kind of I don't know how to answer that one. But, hurricane coverage was obviously impactful on all of the audience. It also entailed a number of days, and it entailed challenges with coverage and resources and all that. So those were always big, and to be able to cover those well, and to be proud of what happened, be proud of what you did, and so forth afterwards. Those were probably important. To this day, I'll never forget, as a young radio news reporter in Lubbock, I went to my first traffic accident with fatality, and stumbling around, not really knowing too much what I was doing, until you see the body of a child lying by a car. And you just, that one sticks in my mind still today. It's just not fun.
Yeah.
It's not fun. So those sound like, oh, that was an inconsequential story. Well, not to that family.
Yeah. Right. So while you were, I'm embarrassed to confess, I didn't realize that you taught courses at Lamar. And I shouldn't confess it on the air because I pretend to know everything. But
well, one course. Find Brian Ballantyne. He was a student of mine.
Really? Well, and Brian's right down the street from me. I can go ask. But were there people, or while you were in college, was there something that really inspired you to think? I mean, it sounds like you kind of moved into your career by sort of just things that happened that showed up. But was there anybody who inspired you to say, you know what, this is the course I'm going to take. This is a good direction for me.
Well, I think, anytime from my perspective, and once again, you got to remember that I was a less than aggressive academic type. So, but I always enjoyed courses. So, for example, we had a journalism course at Texas Tech, and the professor used to be a writer for the Associated Press. So the credentials of the instructor would impress me. So therefore, I would sleep less in that class.
I'm sorry. That's an amusing.
I'm being full disclosure about yours truly here in his, and you know what, but first, and Lamar, and I mentioned Dr. Brentlinger. I had a course under him. I think it was called Persuasion, and I didn't interact with a lot of professors at Lamar, so I don't pretend to compare him to many other great professors who I've gotten to know later on through other connections. But he was he was the consummate instructor and professor in my mind, and because, like Lamar's culture and reputation of being so close to the students and understanding the students and being concerned about the students as individuals, in many cases, he was a prime example of that in my book. And I know that's replicated for many years over many of the positions at Lamar University. And that's when people ask me about Lamar, that's what I tell them. That, you know, it's a great school, and you're going to be recognized as an individual as much as just another person on campus as a head count as part of this year's semester enrollment numbers. But he was one. And so, but I was always intrigued by, I wanted courses from people that had a credential in the field that I was interested in.
Right.
So when you're 21 years old, I mean, American history didn't light my fire. So I was, you know, yeah, you're a great history professor, but
yeah, Ellen Renstra is probably watching, and so Ellen, we love history, but in this moment, it was.
I love Ellen Renstra; she's great. As I've matured, I've come to appreciate fine educators much more, and I would come to any course that Ellen was teaching, and I love history now. I do.
Right. So we've got a couple of questions that have come in, but when you brought Brock up, it made me think of, I never knew Brock as an instructor. When I was at Lamar, he was an administrator the entire time. And one of my first days on the job, he called me into his office and he said, you have to become involved in our community because we're educating people from our community, and you have to understand who it is that we're educating if you're going to do your job right. I assume, and Brock was a brilliant man who anything he said I agreed with, but I assume it's the same way in your industry. I mean, you and your wife are extraordinarily involved in our community. Was that driven by a professional need, or is that sort of satisfying a personal need of yours?
Well, in all honesty, I think when you first come to the job in this community, you should realize right away it's helpful if you know who the people are in the community. And it's sort of like on the sales side of this business. You know, you get to know people and you make connections, you make relationships for business purposes. So some of that there, but after you get involved, after you say, well, I'm the news director, so I ought to go attend the blah, blah, you know, and you join and you go to the blah, blah, and you do what you think you're supposed to do about that. But after you do that and you age up a little bit, then you really realize how important these connections are and what community can mean and how necessary it is for any community. So I think it becomes, maybe at first it's an obligation, part of your role, but then later on, I think you realize the more connections you make and the more involved you are and the more you know, the better you're going to be in the community, and therefore it can reflect on your job.
All right. Well, and so we're going to, like I said, we're going to move back to some of the questions, and this may be one of the last ones we ask because I don't want to overstep our time, Larry, but one of our viewers, James, wants to know your opinion on how social media and digital media have impacted or transformed news coverage in our country.
Well, I can remember pretty distinctly after Walter Cronkite retired, I was at an industry function, and he spoke fairly disparagingly about the status of broadcast journalism in general. And I was so surprised at that moment to hear him say that, having just come out of the field that he'd been in for ever how many years it was, a long time. Then I began so about the time I was retiring, social media was just beginning to ramp up. And as I mentioned earlier, my personal, and this is my personal view, is the state of journalism in general in this country right now, not just broadcast journalism, but broadcast journalism is a part of this problem, is not up to the standard that the country needs, that the people need. And we have this amazing technology to be able to deliver so much more, but we're delivering, in my view, a poor product. And when I say the product, I'm talking about the news content. News content is formed by reporters who operate under a set of journalistic standards. And it seems, and maybe I'm just getting old and crotchety, but it just seems like that I see it's so shallow by so many reporters. And part of it is the economics that have taken over in the mainstream, the so-called mainstream media. And I don't mean anything politically slanted about that one way or the other. But newspaper, well, we've seen what's happened to newspaper, but broadcast, cable, and then now social media. Ownership has a lot to do with that. And as the demand for bigger profits continues, as consolidations continue, as cost cutting is one of the ways that they try to achieve those goals, it affects journalism. Good journalism takes time. You don't do, I'm nothing political here, but let's just take a Watergate investigation. Those kinds of investigations take reporters days, weeks, months, and they have to be given the freedom to go do that on their own schedule. Typical television station, not many years ago, a reporter would come in the morning and you might say to them, here's your 2 or 3 stories that you're responsible for today. You get to do one big story, but that's one day. It's just hard to really do significant reporting. It just takes more time and resources than I see owners being willing to invest in at this point, or the skills possessed by some of the reporters. If you gave them a week, they still wouldn't come back with anything decent because they're not honed up to those levels yet. So, and social media to me is a train wreck because there's no oversight. There's no editor. There's nobody asking the question. Everybody gets to report their opinion. It's a giant editorial board. It's not a giant journalistic platform, in my view. And so now there's all this discussion about, well, Google will put this on or Twitter won't put that on. They've all got their standards. But they're not what you would call newsroom editors or senior producers that are questioning you. Juan, you want to put that story on Facebook? Well, wait a minute. Let's talk about who'd you talk to about that? What are your facts? Who are your sources? Where's that? What's the point of your story? I don't care. I'm really upset about this. And I'm going to put it out there. And I think this happened because Aunt Jane told me it did. So it happened. To me, and I cannot tell you how often I hear people, where did you hear that? Well, I saw it on Facebook. Yeah. Really? So it's had to happen if it was on Facebook, right? So I just find that disturbing to me. And I have a hard time finding stuff to watch that I can watch for more than a few minutes on television. And God bless us that poor newspaper business is gone. Yeah. All due respects to the efforts being made by the Chronicle and the Beaumont Enterprise to keep going. Hearst has given it a shot, but I've worked for a company that was largely, we were owned by Beaulieu and we sold to Freedom Newspapers. Freedom Newspaper was a huge newspaper company. There were about 5 of us broadcast stations. On their balance sheet, we were carried as other for many years. Okay. And I saw that turn in a matter of short number of years to where the broadcast stations were carrying the newspaper. And these were significant newspapers. The Orange County Register in Orange County, California was a huge newspaper. Anyway, so I've drifted off into my tirade about journalism and the state of the ownership there were limits. The FCC had limits on how many broadcast stations you could own. And it was a number. It was a raw number at one time. Then it became, well, your audience can't exceed a certain percentage of the United States population. So you can own a lot of small stations or you can own 3 big ones, but you can't exceed whatever percent of the U.S. Viewership there is. And I don't know. I don't own stock in their company, but I think the current owners of KFDM, Sinclair Broadcasting, somebody told me they're now up to like 170 television stations. When in my day, the max was 7.
Yeah.
So,
anyway. Alas, thank you. It's an interesting. Your field is fascinating and changing all the time. So, just right before we leave, Larry, I wanted to go back to the core of what we do here is preparing the next generation of individuals who will be delivering the news and actually doing all the production and hopefully be the ones who will make decisions on things like ownerships and how news is presented. So you and your wife have been remarkably involved at all of your universities. So let's end with a discussion on why it is that y'all are so involved in education. What sort of that bring to you?
Well, in my involvement at both Texas Tech and Lamar with mass communications students, this to me just wildly exciting because I know I've spoken somewhat disparagingly about young reporters these days and being ill-equipped and so forth. Well, it just takes time. In my time, it didn't. If you learned radio news in a year, then you were pretty much had a PhD in radio news. I mean, it wasn't real complicated. The technology was pretty simple, and the journalism hadn't changed over the years. So these young students today, to me, are remarkably, the students at Lamar now, for example, in mass comm, they're remarkably intelligent and nimble. And when I say intelligent, the technology that they can utilize at their fingertips is amazing, that they can do social media and they can do all these different things and they understand it. I don't understand it, but they can understand it. All I hope is that there's a core foundation, and that's all great on a lot of fronts. The core foundation of journalism, the journalism courses are the ones, and the writing courses are the ones that I hope these kids realize that they have great skills to distribute product and create product, sit in front of a computer and make wonderful things happen. But the core of it is, what's the meat and potatoes of that? What's the reporting behind it? What's the journalism behind it so that it's meaningful? I can be dazzled by all kinds of animations and GIFs or whatever they do on all these social platforms, and they're entertaining, but I'm not sure that I'm any smarter. Do I know what my city council is going to do next week? Do I know what the appraisal district might do with our appraisals and our taxes? And how are my schools? I mean, it's just, but I think what the universities have done in response to a field that has had breakneck speed technology changes and developments has really, really been remarkable. And I'm sure it's a good thing for the universities because there are a lot of students that want those opportunities and want that knowledge. So I applaud all the colleges and universities that are involved in it. And I don't mean to imply they're not doing a good job, but I just think there's some components that somehow we need to ramp up. We just need to get I keep going back to it, get the journalism back up into reporting and people are attracted to spectacular. We like movies that go boom and drive off cliffs and that sort of thing. But that doesn't really make us functionally any better the next morning. Right. And so there's a balance between attracting eyeballs and selling ads and making money for the owners and being responsible to our communities and improving our communities. And there's so many ways and so many tools out there. And these young people are so adept at that. I hope we can close that gap someday. What I see is a gap. Now, everybody else may be just having great time reading Facebook every day and sailing on down the creek. I don't know.
It's a positive note to end on, Larry. On our future does look bright with these really brilliant students who are going to be leading us in the future. So I guess we'll end it here. We've gone a little bit longer than I anticipated, and it's my fault. I just can't stop listening to you. But Larry, thank you for taking the time. You're a good guy and a good friend to Lamar, and we appreciate your taking time to be with us.
Well, I'm honored that you asked me to visit with everybody tonight, and I had a great time doing it. And if you kind of carve off a lot of the rambling edges that I took off on, maybe it was helpful to somebody. So anyway,
it was delightful.
Everybody at Lamar does a wonderful job, and I know it's a difficult time in a lot of fields, and I know it's a difficult time at Lamar. So we salute you and the rest of the administration out there with what you're doing, and wish you the best of luck.
You're very kind, and it's not hyperbole, but it is good to hear your voice, Larry. It's nice to hear.
Well, it's good to still be able to be heard, okay?
Thank you, and I thank everybody for joining us this evening. And if you had questions that I didn't get to, or if you want to ask questions after the fact, for those of you who watch this later, you know how to get a hold of Shannon Figueroa, and go ahead and send your questions, and we'll get them to Larry for you. Larry, again, thank you for your time, and we will leave this evening with a video from our marketing communications department. Thank you.
In trying times, I'm here for my community.
I will reach my students over any distance.
I'm committed to delivering truth.
Keeping families fed is my purpose.
Taking care of people is my passion.
At Lamar University, I was given the skills I need to provide essential services.
No matter where I am.
I'm still here, helping those in need.
And even though we can't always be face-to-face,
it's because of what I learned at Lamar University that I can be here for you.
Our moment is here.
Our moment is now.
Make the most of it at Lamar University.